found out those were the comments are about 70 characters. More than that, people don't want to read it. That gets read the most. Now, in a tweeting, texting, Facebook world, that's revealed. Microsoft did a recent study of how long individuals engage with one computer screen. And they measured one screen, 8 seconds. That's taking into everything, your devices, flipping through. My goodness, the memory of a goldfish, they say, is 9 seconds. we're sub-goldfish in our attention span. Now, this is a dilemma if you love to do biblical preaching, and I do. If I could invent the class to teach in biblical preaching, the congregation to preach to, I would do nothing but exposition. Look at this word, look at the next word. And yet, if you are experienced looking at people while you're doing that, after a few minutes of that, they check out. I call it the bobblehead time if it's a Bible church. They're looking at the Bible, looking at you. Ask the late David Buttrick, who taught preaching at Vanderbilt, said, how long can people engage listening to exposition? Several years ago, David said 4 or 5 minutes. More recently, I asked Leonard Sweet, the United Methodist, kind of a guru, semiologist, how long can people listen, you think, Leonard, to one movement in a sermon? And he said 2 or 3. That is a shrinking attention span to the explanation of Scripture. Do you experience that? Yeah. I mean, it's so different, say, from the world like Martin Lloyd-Jones preached in, the great English preacher, Heart of London. It took 14 years going through London, word by word. Going through Romans, word by word. On Friday nights, 2,000 people came and listened to Lloyd-Jones. 14 years. You can listen to them on the Lloyd-Jones Legacy set. I don't think that kind of attention exists in the church anymore. If it is, I don't know where it is. And here's the challenge. I have to preach to the congregation that's there, not the congregation I wish was there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I can't preach to an imaginary church. The average reading level in the congregation, through several studies, is 10th grade. So I've got to keep in mind, for one thing, the average reading comprehension level is 10th grade. So one of the reasons for using lived experiences is to recall people's attention so they can get back to the text. Now, if you watch people when you're explaining a text, would you look at this word? Would you notice that word? Here's what Nebuchadnezzar means as a name. Here's where Nehemiah worked. You do that, they're intense, they're listening, they're taught, they're almost leaning forward. Now, when you start to tell a story, there's a physical difference in the people. They breathe out, they sit back. You don't have to tell them, here comes a story. They know it. It's a different way of listening. One reason for using lived experience in my preaching is to buy back their attention to the text. That is, lived experiences are not the end of the sermon. And of all things, they're not to be like Tiffany lamps. Now, Tiffany lamp is an expensive cut glass lamp from the Tiffany Glass Works. Real ones sell for tens of thousands of dollars. I don't have one, but the reason you buy one is not to use, it's to look at. You know, ooh, is that a Tiffany lamp? You don't use it, you look at the lamp, which is kind of silly. On the other hand, I take a lot of nighttime walks. And there's street lights that show the way. I cannot remember one time that I ever stopped and said, ooh, what a street light. Street lights show the way. A good sermon illustration or story is not a Tiffany lamp. It's not there to call attention to itself so that people move out of the text. It's there to shine light on the text. Yeah. So one of the reasons is to reclaim people's attention. Now, another reason to use lived experiences is to help explain difficult concepts. Now, you can't get into biblical preaching very long without knowing you run into concepts theologically that are not easily accessible to the average person in the pew. That is, they're abstract, they're difficult, they're challenging, or they're not able to be acquired just by talking. Say in Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. We will not fear, though the earth is moved, the mountains fall in the sea, and the sea roars. Remember that? So there's a city, the streams of which make this glad. There's a river, the streams of which make glad the city of God. And he will help just at the break of day. Now, if I'm preaching through that, there are images in that at every point that would be helped by a story. For example, the psalmist imagines, there in verse 3, an unimaginable catastrophe. Earth cracks open. A Hebrew's tendency would be to run up to the mountains. They're falling into the sea. The next place, the only other place a Hebrew could go would be in the sea, in a tsunami. Everything is coming apart that can come apart. Now that calls for a story. I can help people lean into that by telling an equivalent story. I might tell the story of the oil platform built by the North Shore Company off of England. It was a 30-story tall oil platform in the North Sea. It had been engineered to withstand a 100-foot tall wave, 30 stories, 100-foot wave, but it could withstand it. Or a 100-knot wind. And yet one morning when a tanker crested the horizon, it was gone. Took more than 70 people with it. To this day, nobody knows what hit it. But what we do know is it didn't have what it took not to get shook up when everything shook down. Now that image can be put side by side with the image in Psalm 46. Everything was shaking down. But it contemporizes that, pulls it out of wasness into isness. It helps clarify a point. One reason you tell stories is to help shed light on the image in Scripture. I'm not likely going to be standing right on top of an earthquake while mountains fall over into the sea and there's a tsunami. It's more accessible to me to think about an oil platform that fell into the sea. And that's one of the principles of all illustrating. And that is, you're taking something in the world that is lower, lesser, and lighter. It's abbreviated LLL. And you're comparing it to something higher, holier, and heavier. All principles of illustration relates to this. Here's something that in life, nature, or your life on the lower, lesser, lighter level, has a point of contact with a higher, holier, heavier. And where that point of contact is where you use the lived experience. How Jesus did this. All but two of his parables are secular stories. There's two of them. One about the Pharisee and the publican that's theological. Rich man in Dives has some theology. The rest of it is about a sower who went to sow. A crook who took the books and changed the invoices. A son who ran away from home. They're secular stories. But he told those because those lower, lesser, lighter stories had a point of contact with the higher, holier, heavier truth of the gospel. All illustrating works this way. Lower, lesser, lighter to illustrate the higher, holier, heavier. Let's take Psalm 1, a very well-known psalm. Blessed the man. You know, this, the walk, sit, stand, or sit, stand, walk. In the counsel of the ungodly, the scoffer. Remember what I said, he shall be like a what? Tree planted by rivers of water. Now, there's two big images right there. Tree image, rivers of water. Now, for the typical person, that may not immediately suggest that that tree was growing down in the Jordan Rift. The only place you find big trees in the Holy Land today is down in the cleft in the earth, growing by the Jordan, where their roots have resources. That's the picture. Tree planted by a river of water in that arid land. Those are the trees that flourish. If I want to illustrate that, I might go to a search engine. Look for tree, look for water, do some research. I find out that the tree on this planet that has the deepest known roots, there's a little tree that grows in South Africa that has roots 400 feet deep. It's not a big tree, but its roots go down 400 feet to subterranean pools of water that are 400 feet in the earth, water caves. And regardless of what's happening on the surface, drought, it has hidden resources. Now, that helps bring it out of thenness to nowness, helps people grasp that. So one reason for stories is to clarify what you're talking about. I like going about that, but I want to go on to the qualities of lived experience in sermons today. What needs to typify the stories that you tell? What characteristics do they have? Well, one, they need to be credible. It's a kind of a reflection on our profession that when people tell an incredible story, sometimes people say, that's just a preacher story. You ever heard that? Yeah. That's just that means that thing probably didn't happen on this planet. In today's world, with the devices that people have, almost anything you say is being checked right there in church. I misnumbered a president not long ago. It's Theodore Roosevelt. I can't remember the city. He's 23 and he's number 26 or the other way around. Somebody came out of the door.
They Googled it.
Huh? Yeah. You were wrong about it. I mean, during this credibility matters. Now, you have a device in search engines to try to validate the credibility authentically of the story that you're telling. Now, one thing I'd encourage you to do is kill off the incredible stories, because they undermine your credibility when you talk about the things of God. There's a transfer of expertise if you tell good stories. There's a transfer of non-expertise if you tell stories everybody out there knows didn't happen. Let me give you an example. There's a sermon story that I thought had died, been buried, and was never coming back. And it's like Dracula, keeps coming back. You may have heard it. I heard it from a preacher. Frankly, I really didn't believe this preacher used it. He's preaching on the cross and how in Christ God took the hand of his son and he took our hand. It's a nice image. But the story went like this. World War I, in the trenches, the British boys had a phone line back to headquarters that went through no man's land. A bomb fell and broke that phone line, and they couldn't get the word from headquarters. So one of the boys jumped out of the trench, strafed with fire, took one piece of the phone wire in one hand and one in the other. And the message got through. Even though the shock killed him. That's what Jesus did. No, it's not. Because that's a third grader knows that story is ridiculous. You've got a broken phone line in both hands, ain't nothing going to go through you. And there's not enough shock there to kill anybody. See, it's completely fabricated. You can't find that. It didn't happen. Now, that illustrates sometimes the worst things, about sermon stories, and that is not credible. Look, when an athlete is on the way up, on the way up to pros, signs a big pro contract, gets a bonus, they also make a lot of money through what? Endorsements.
Yes.
You think about it, it's kind of funny. That athlete may not know any more about razor blades or fountain pens or whatever than I do, but if they hold one up, say, ooh, he can really throw a football. He must know a lot about Yeah, that's crazy. But that's what it's based on. Stands by a Chevrolet, ooh, man, you know, he can get 3 pointers if he drives a Chevrolet.
Yeah.
That thing must be special. When you think about it, it's goofy, but it works. But what do they lose when they get in trouble? And endorsements.
Yeah.
I don't want you anywhere around my stuff.
Yeah.
It's a transfer of non-expertise. Now, come close to me. In the stories you tell at preaching from life and nature, there's a transfer either of expertise or non-expertise. If it's a goofy story that people know never happened, then they come to this. If he doesn't know that, then what do they know about God? See the syllogism?
Yeah.
Let me tell you what, I still remember a 3rd grader in the pew at a church, and I heard a pastor comparing something to the planets. And he started naming things in the sky. He said it's like Mercury, Venus, Earth, Halley's Comet, the North Star. He started naming stuff I knew wasn't a planet. And you know what happened in my little 3rd grade head? I still remember. If he doesn't know what I know about planets, he's trying to tell me about God. And it's been a little bit since I was in the 3rd grade. I still remember that.
Wow.
Make them credible. Number 2, make them fresh. One of the problems with sermon stories is so many of them have been used so many times they're stale.
Yeah.
If you fell over, the church could finish the story. Make them fresh. Now we're going to talk in a minute about how the web has opened up an opportunity in illustrating that never existed in the history of Christian preaching. You can find fresh, credible, detailed stories that are new. You can do that. One thing is just look at life, and the stories will come to you if you know where you're going in your preaching. It's a good reason to plan your preaching instead, to find fresh stories. If I know that 4 weeks from now, okay, I'm going to be preaching on covetousness, then every story that comes up about greed or generosity, point or counterpoint, could feed into that story. Now, if I don't know that's where I'll be in 4 weeks, I don't know what to look for. But if I've planned preaching and know 4 weeks out, preach on covetous, maybe 5 weeks out here, I'm going to preach on depression. 6 weeks. It's not so much that I have to find stories as they find me, if I know where I'm going. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
It sensitizes you. You know, if I know I'm going to need it. Now, let me go back to my little message, if you were in there when I spoke. It seems a long time, it was about an hour ago. I started with a story that I read in the New Yorker magazine about a specialized kind of Japanese cooking that was sensitive to seasons.
That was a great story.
Now, if I didn't know that Dr. Didway had given me the assignment to preach about preaching out of season, I would have skimmed right over that.
Yeah.
But because I knew I was going to have to talk about out of season, it gave me a counterpoint story that was all around one thing. A cuisine that is super obsessed with seasons.
That was a great.
But I saw that because I knew what I needed. Now, I want to urge you, there's nothing that drives finding good stories like having planned your preaching and knowing what's out here. I promise you, in the providence and prearrangement of God, things will find you. Bus bench backs, bumper store billboards, bumper stickers. Look at some bumper stickers. Fred Craddock, the preacher who's gone on now. He found them in the most curious thing. One of my favorite stories about Fred is he was down south somewhere, saw an old pickup, had a bumper sticker on him. He was going to preach on a church with a big vision, a church trying to reach all people. And he saw this bumper sticker on the back of a pickup. The bumper sticker said, "I love Jesus, I love my wife, the rest of y'all can go to hell." And it was perfect for his sermon because he was preaching about a narrow, bigoted view of the church. You know, yeah, what a gospel. I love Jesus, love my wife. What's that the rest of you? A bumper sticker. It's not that they're not there. Fresh, credible stories are everywhere, particularly if you know where you're going with your preaching. Are you with me? Now, a third thing, make them detailed. One detailed story is better than half a dozen ambiguous stories. A detailed story draws people in. Say I'm talking about reactions to grief. I could make a generalized statement that of all the families in America that have been acquainted with grief, surely the Kennedy family must be one of the most acquainted. But what did I just tell? I just tell people what people know if they know anything about it. Yeah, that's true, a lot of them died. But I've told you that's not engaging. It's not engaging. But what if I say, Joe Kennedy Jr. was the favored son who was supposed to be the president. Joe Sr. had engineered things for that. But World War II, he took a suicide assignment. He and some others in a plane were to fly a plane filled with bombs straight into a German rocket site. The idea was they were going to bail out, but Joe Jr. didn't get out. There in Hyannisport, that famous Kennedy compound, as it's called, Joe Sr. and Rose, JFK, RFK, Ted's little boy, sitting out on the porch when they saw two priests coming. It wasn't unusual. A lot of priests came. They were a Catholic family, but these men looked very sober. On that porch, they had to break the news. The oldest favorite son lost his life. Biography, the biography called The Patriarch said Joe Kennedy Sr. went up to his room, shut the door, and was never the same. Rose went immediately to church. She was a devout woman. The first reaction she had, she went to the parish church. JFK told RFK and Ted Kennedy, let's go sail. Joe would want us to go sail. Three reactions to sudden grief. Avoid it, let's go sail. Go into despair, lock yourself in a room. Or turn to some resource beyond yourself. Go to God's house. Now see, isn't that story better told in detail than just saying, well, the Kennedys sure had a lot of grief. Man, that's sad. I told people what they already know. Y'all tracking with me? Yeah. Find the details. Now you have in the internet search engines the ability to find details at hand. Click, click, click. That will enrich your sermon stories beyond anything I can measure. It's all right there at your fingers. Literally, the whole of human printed knowledge is being scanned in. Oxford University is the oldest university in the English-speaking world. The Bodleian Library is one of the greatest libraries in the world. Microsoft is scanning everything in it. All human knowledge is written, searchable. I mean, so to speak. It's going to be there. There's nothing you can think of you can't find details about. You'll enrich your sermon stories if you will capture some details. It's worth the extra 20 minutes of effort for what it will do to engage people in your sermons. Does that make sense? Make them credible, make them fresh, make them detailed. Now the next thing is make them organic. And here's what I mean by organic. It fits that movement of that sermon. You don't tell illustrations just because you're losing people's attention. You say, I think I'll tell a joke about my dog, when that doesn't have a thing to do
Right.
You know what I'm talking about? You know, I heard a funny one on the way to church, and I can tell these folks are checking out while I'm talking about justification. So I'm gonna tell a story about my dog. What's your talking? The story needs to grow out of the exposition, okay? One thing I try to tell the students on preaching at Bigler concerning the whole process of biblical preaching. He uses, I owe this image to H. Grady Davis's great book, Designed for Preaching. He says, think of the sermon like a tree. It roots in the soil of the text. That's exegetical work. I like what our young preacher said after I preached. He said, look, it doesn't matter at all what you think the text meant. What matters is what Paul meant. That's exegetical work. You're trying to find the author's intent in the text. Now, to use Haddon Robinson's idea, the trunk is the steady, big idea. In one sentence, what the sermon's about. Now, that will organically grow into several points or moves. You'll have to excuse the bad tree art there. I'm doing it the best I can. But when you tell a story that doesn't illustrate one of those points, you just tell a story to tell a story, it's like putting a kite in a tree. Now, if you go out and see a kite in a tree, you don't think, ooh, that tree grew a kite. No, you think that doesn't, that is an accident. Some stories that get told in sermons would be like repairing Notre Dame, you know, that terrible tragedy. 1,000-year-old stones. What if they repaired it by going to Home Depot and getting some cheap vinyl siding? You know, we're gonna glue this here on the cathedral. No, it doesn't belong. That means that when you're telling stories in your sermons, they need to grow organically out of the image in the text or the concept. Now let me give you two examples. Let's say I'm preaching from 1 Peter. Come to him, the living stone, and you as living stones are being built up into a spiritual house. Now what's the big image there? Stone. Stone. If I'm going to tell a story, it doesn't need to be about my dog. The image is stone. I need a fetching story about stones, and also something that might touch that strange phrase, living stone. So I might begin the sermon with a story. I've been there probably a half dozen times. Like to go back there. It's southwest of London, out in the cow pasture. There's a circle of silent stones. They've been there thousands of years. They're a mystery. Stonehenge. People we don't even know about worship something there. There's a magnetic quality about those huge stones that draws people from all over the world because they're stone. If you don't like that, you can go across the Atlantic up to the Dakotas, and they're commissioned by Theodore Roosevelt. 4 faces carved into Mount Rushmore. People go out of their way to see these living faces carved into stone. You can see 3 of them on your money. You don't have to go up there. And yet, because they're carved into stone, people go see them. There's something magnetic about mighty stones. In our text, Peter says, come to him a living stone. It's an oxymoron. It's a stone, it's not living. If it's living, it's not a stone. But he puts those words together to talk about all of the magisterial solidity of the Lord Jesus Christ. You can't live and go around him. He's there. And yet he's a living stone. Now see, the image there is what? Stone. If there's an image in the text, river, tree, stone, wall, whatever it is, choose stories around that image. If it's Nehemiah building a wall, find some stories about wallness. Berlin Wall divided the city, a wall of infamy. Great Wall of China, biggest thing you can see man-made from space. Vietnam Memorial Wall, sad wall of memory. Talk about warmness, to pull people into that. Or you may be dealing not with an image, but with a concept. Find something about that concept. Say the parable of the talents, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. That word talent is a bit misleading because it was the largest coin minted in the Roman world. We kind of taken it and applied it to various guests, but really that parable is a parable about risk. The 5 talent and 2 talent servant were willing to risk. The 1 talent servant buried it. Now Luke makes him elegantly riskless. Luke said he buried it in a napkin, but he buried it anyway. So the stories you need to find about that sermon are stories of people willing on a lower, lesser, lighter level to take a risk. Opens up everything. Hang gliders, people who shoot the rapids on the Colorado River. One of my colleagues at Truett, just now retiring, Liling Nunn, a rock climber. Tiny little lady wedges her fingers and toes in sheer rock walls, climbs up them. Spider, risk. We love to watch other people risk.
Yeah.
But Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you better be willing to take some risk. See, that's the concept. Now keep those 2 things in mind. Either an image, dog, whatever, sheep, got sheep, find out something about sheep. You know, I talked to a sheep farmer once. We talked about sheep. I asked this sheep farmer, rancher, he had a bunch of sheep. I said, what one thing you tell me about sheep? He didn't even stop. He said, dumb. He said, they're the dumbest animal God made. Well, talk about how dumb sheep are from a sheep farm. See what I'm saying? Whatever the image is, talk about that image as a lived experience. Don't import something that's not organic, okay? Now, let's move on from that quickly, because this is something typically I take seminary a couple of weeks. The sources. You say, well, that's good. Where do you find it? Charles Spurgeon, in his classic book, Lectures to My Students, discusses, and read that book. It's classic. Spurgeon started a college for preachers. He went out there on Friday afternoon. You can imagine this preacher that was as famous as Queen Victoria had a room full of students just like this. Went out on Friday, lectured. Some of his lectures were on illustrations. And he talked about them in terms of windows for your house. It's an interesting metaphor. He said, nobody wants a house that's all windows. But you also don't want a house with no windows. You want windows appropriately placed in the house. They call lived experiences windows. I've expanded on that a little. And I'm talking about finding windows for your house. But also finding windows when you don't know what house they're going to go in. Now that means in all of your reading and observing, you're always looking for stories that might work in a sermon. It's that odd thing that grabs your attention in the newspaper, the magazine, strange statement on the billboard, an advertisement. It could be anything, and it grabs you. You say, you know, that could be in a sermon. Let me give you an example of one from a while back, just reading a newspaper. This heiress died in Miami. She'd inherited $25 million in a mansion and a household staff of 5 people. She left the whole fortune to 3 chihuahuas. Her son barely got anything. When the newspaper said, what do you think about that? He said it all went to the dogs. Now, if you read a story like that, that ought to grab your attention. You're going to be preaching about values, stewardship, legacy. What a legacy. I left it all to dogs. That has sermon story all over. Let me tell you something. if you will, in just simply reading the daily paper or whatever your home page is on your computer, if you just thumb through Facebook, I hope not too much, it'll numb your mind. You will find everywhere things that grab your mind. They're windows, you just don't know what house they'll go in. Now here's the key. When you see things anywhere, put a category on them. What big thing is this about in life? Everything's about something in life. You know, you see one of these portable billboards. I've seen one down here on Eldridge. It was kind of amusing to me in one way, sad in another. It says, divorce, $39.95. You know, right there. Note that. Just say, that's silly. Cost a whole lot more than that. $39.95? You know, see what I'm saying? So right there on the billboard. You're walking in Muir Woods, off the Golden Gate Bridge, these 1,000-year-old coastal redwoods. I'm going to talk about them tomorrow night. Those trees never grow alone. They only grow in a copse with a group of others because they hold one another up with their roots. When I read that on a sign, I put it in my notebook. You need some way to write stuff down. The dullest pencil's better than the sharpest mind. Fred Craddock challenged preachers to do this. Do this. Remember 3x5 cards? You know, I'm a flat earther. I still use them. Other people put stuff on their devices. He said, do one a day. He said, discipline yourself. Something you read, see, hear, observe in nature. Fred said, do one a day. Now, you're finding windows, but you don't know what house. You gonna track me? That's the best way. Now, say when you're reading books, you make yourself a homiletical index in the book. Now, that's different from other kind of index that has names. The homiletical index is the categories of things that you find in the book. You're reading a page, it's about discipline in the person's life. You're reading a page, it's about the influence of a father in a person's life. You're reading a page about risk in this person's life. Put out in the margin what's going on in that person's life as a big category. The whole of things you can read can become illustrative. I make a practice of it in books that just seem to be odd. People probably didn't think I was reading that book. A while back, a biography came out of the famous television chef, Julia Child. Anybody remember her? Tall lady talk like this, you know, we're gonna make a chicken today. So funny, she'd drop them on the floor and pick them up and stuff. It's kind of awkward, very uncanny. Became world famous. World famous. Cook things. The biography came out. I'd always been engaged listening to her. I bought it. I read it. It's full of illustrations. Her father never one time blessed her or commended her. When she was world famous, she'd go home to her home in California. He'd criticize her. She longed for affirmation. Even after she was world famous. Millions of people loved her. More than anything else. What is that? Man, that's a story. Or, the other sad thing about her was, she and her husband Paul were completely secular. I didn't know that. It really made me sad to read it. I wasn't mad. Certainly wasn't glad. I was sad. She was just secular. They had no transcendence, no faith, nothing spiritual in their life. They were complete secularists. I thought to myself, here's this woman that so many people loved, felt attached to, and absolutely no faith. She and Paul didn't have any children. When he died, she wrote their friends what to me was a haunting phrase. She said, Paul slipped off the raft. Goodness. What a sad thing to say. The only thing you could say is he slipped off a raft. And then when she got old, nearly 96, knew she was in her last illness, she said, I'm about to slip off the raft. I made note of that, of how sad that is if the only concept you have of the end of mortal life is I'm going to slip off a raft. Thank God. I can say with Paul, if this tent is dissolved, I have a building not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. That's not slipping off anybody's raft. Yeah. I'll use that sometime. Well, you should use it. You can use it. You can just say, it came to me while I was at church. The reason I'm using that is that ordinarily people, first of all, wouldn't think that a theology professor might be reading the biography of a television cook, and it was. I read it out of a remote curiosity. But in the margin, all over that book, I put categories. What's this about? It's about facing mortality. Learn to read by putting in the margin of everything you're reading the category. What's that about? Does that make sense? Save it. Now, that's finding windows, but you don't know what house they're going in. Now, you flip that script, and here's where most preachers are. You got a house without a window. You got all kinds of exegetical notes. You know all about your text. You set it up and down, back and forward. You know exactly what James meant or Paul meant, but you don't have a single story for that Sunday sermon. Now that's where using the search engine becomes a resort that no generation of preachers ever had to the degree you have it. And that is any image or any concept in that text is available. Now it takes a little work because you have to do this. First of all, it's like I say, it's like the 49ers, 1849ers who found gold out in Yosemite, in California. First of all, they prospected. You've seen that in movies, you know. Scruffy guys out prospecting, looking for gold. That's what you're doing. When you're looking for a certain story, you say, I need a story about generosity. Well, you prospect for it. Now, when you find it in the internet, it comes out not like you're going to use it. It comes out like ore. It's in there, but you can't use the whole thing. Okay? So you have to refine it. And they found gold in ore. It was refined. And then it had to be fit into what you wanted to make it. Melted, would it be a ring? And molded, would it be a ring? Would it be a bracelet? What would that gold be? Now this is what it's like to find stories on the internet. Start out with something big. I'm preaching about it's better to give than to receive. When you need a story, because most people don't believe it. They don't. That trips off our tongue. You know, one person out of 10 sitting in front of you who really believes it. It's better to give than receive. They may say amen. They say, oh me, really. You need a story. You need a story about generosity that shows how good it is to give. So, what's going to happen if you put in the search engine generosity? You're going to have 10 zillions. It's way too big. So you're going to have to narrow that with words. Generosity from the Christian faith. Generosity that made it. You narrow it, you prospect for it. When you find it, it'll be part of a longer story. That's the ore. You have to refine it. You have to find what in this do I want to take into my sermon. And then you fit it into the sermon. Now, my estimate is if you need a story and you're going to find the right one, it's usually about a half-hour search. If you're going to find just the right story. You can't do it in 5 minutes. You're going to have to do a good deal of skimming. But you can find a story that sheds light on almost anything, concept or image that you're using. We're just really, with that kind of resource, we're without excuse for finding stories. So remember, 2 ways. First of all, you're a window shopper. That is, you're looking for windows. You don't know what house they'll like. You're collecting stories that'll go on a sermon Sunday. Those are best. You find them in context. You find them yourself. They can sit there and ripen. They ripen. The more you think about it, you see how the story might work in a sermon. It's good to have an index of those. And remember, the dullest pencil is better than the sharpest mind. You won't remember it. Write it down. The other, though, more likely is that you come to Friday or Saturday, you've got a house with no windows. You've got an understanding of the text, but you really don't have any stories about it. Then go to the web, learn how to look for stories. Now, wrap it up, and I want to keep faith with time. What time do you have here?
4:27.
4, okay, very quick. Boom, we're out now. Keep faith. Got a long day. First of all, pitfalls and pointers. Let me just say this. Don't use two when one will do.
All right.
You don't have to double illustrate a concept. There's a lot of Sundays out there,
All right.
okay?
Yes, sir.
Don't use two when one will do. You get 2 stories on covetousness, save one. 2 stories on generosity, on rest, sacrifice, save one. You don't need 2. Secondly, remember they are always subordinate to your exposition. They are the supporting actors, not the stars. Remember my Tiffany lamp streetlight story? The story is not there to call attention to itself, regardless of what you're talking about. Now let me say one thing about personal stories, and I'll let you go. The first resort for many preachers is personal stories. That's okay to a point, but the gospel is not always the gospel according to you. Number one, you haven't had enough stuff happen to you to illustrate anything. And number 2, the church gets tired of hearing about you. Oh, look how cute our family is. You know, look how cute my kids are. Our dog's like no other dog. Let me tell you the best kind of personal story to tell. Tell self-deprecatory personal stories.
Yeah.
Don't make yourself think of, oh, I pray more. I give more. I don't know if this church is worthy of me being pastor. Don't do that. Tell how you need the gospel just like they do. When I say it's self-deprecatory, don't, don't say, well, last night I knocked over a convenience store. I don't mean that. I'm just saying, tell stories that show that you need grace. You need the gospel. I've always struggled with Pharisees. How do you illustrate Pharisees? First of all, nobody in the pew thinks they're a Pharisee. They always think that's those people those other. I'm a Pharisee. They one I told the other day that helped me said, I'm a Pharisee. I'm standing before you as a guest preacher today. I am a Pharisee. And they all looked at me. And I said, I know where I'm a Pharisee. I can take you to the place I'm a Pharisee. It's in the 15 items or less checkout line at HEB.
Well, you know you have one.
I'm a counter. I counted a lady the other day had 17 items. She know I need to get out of here and write a sermon about the love of Jesus, and that woman is up there with 17 items. And it's a 15 item. That's what Pharisaism is. Pharisaism counts. It counts. Jesus said what? You count every leaf of mint, anise, and cumin. That lady up there with 17 items, she might be in there after working a double shift.
Yeah.
She might have to put something back because she doesn't have enough money
Yeah.
to pay for it. Look at the kids bar. They're looking at those canned goods like they're gold. And I'm counting items. You see, that's a personal story that doesn't vaunt me. It shows what a item counter I am. You know, see what I'm saying? If you tell stories that are personal, don't make yourself the hero.
Yeah.
Show that you need grace too. Does that make sense?
Awesome.
Now, this is just a tad, like I say, I'll go on about this for 2 weeks at school. I have some in here to testify. We talk about it, but at least this might whet your appetite.
That's great.
Just focus on it. Let me just say this, let you go. It's not some special spiritual gift that a few preachers have. It's a matter of focusing, being in the moment, and live a preaching life, always looking for the lower, lesser, lighter that illustrates the higher, holier heaven. Okay?
That's great.
Well, God bless you. Have a good afternoon.